Thank you very much for coming. My name is Ruth Wallach. I'm Associate Dean for Social Sciences and Humanities Libraries at the University of Southern California, known as USC, a private R1 research institution in Los Angeles. I thank InfoCon for inviting me. I also teach in the USC Online Master of Management in Library and Information Science program, which is housed, in the case of USC, in the Marshall School of Business. I hold an LIS degree from the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA, a fine public R1 institution in Los Angeles. And I also have 2 disciplinary degrees, not library degrees, but disciplinary degrees from USC. I have spent my entire professional career in an R1 academic institution and working in a large research library. And I give you this context because this really contextualizes and informs my experience and my presentation, so just be aware. The premise of my talk, I think, will apply to other kinds of libraries. Some of you may be interested in public libraries or school libraries or specialized libraries, or maybe you're not entirely sure yet what you're interested in, but you're interested in librarianship in general. The premise, one of the premises of library science are the 5 laws of library science by S.R. Ranganathan from 1931. And essentially, Ranganathan, who was an important theoretician of librarianship, a librarian himself, really spoke about both the library as a repository, but also a very functional repository. It's not a warehouse of information, but something that is for use, and also postulated that libraries and librarianship are a growing organism. The 5 laws are so powerful that they went through several changes and repostulations, such as, for example, in 1995, a kind of an affirmation of those 5 laws, but expanding them further into the functionality, the application of technology, and affirming that libraries should be about free access or protecting free access to knowledge, even though we realize that knowledge, of course, is not free, but we're affirming the functionality of libraries in this way. So that's a very important premise. Libraries are parts of institutions. They are organizations. So libraries are not just organized repositories. They're also organized administratively in terms of human resources, etc. We continue being repositories of material and digital cultures. We're also not static institutions, not static professions. We're not fixed in time. It's very important for us going into the profession to acknowledge that we're multimodal and hybrid. We have a lot of expertise in various organizational levels, so we do represent expertise and competencies. Libraries, importantly, are budgets and funding mechanisms, and to get a little bit towards the focus of my topic, we're very visual. The visual culture is all around us. We are as a society, and it's important to sort of recognize going into librarianship that this is part of meta-literacy of libraries. To the extent that the Association of College and Research Libraries, one of the major national organizations within our profession, it's part of the American Libraries Association, has developed competencies for visual literacy in higher education. That's part of standards of information literacy to which librarians adhere and with which we're in constant dialogue. And I've kind of given you a sense of the 4 clumps of visual literacy that ACRL and the American Library Association consider as being important. I will focus on three very specific examples to ground this idea of visual and meta literacy within our profession. Again, they're going to be very specific. They are examples, but they don't represent the totality, the grand totality of our profession. And I will be glad to answer questions since they may be somewhat peculiar examples of visual accessibility as practiced by our profession. So let me see if I can move forward just a moment. Maybe I can't. I seem to be stuck. Aha! The physicality of libraries. When somebody says a library, we usually think of library as a space and a place. That's not true, of course. As I alluded earlier, libraries are hybrid. There's a lot of what we do that is in virtual space, and libraries very much are about multimodality, but we still refer to libraries in physical terms. And the physical aspect of libraries is very important, both visually, symbolically, but also in terms of accessibility. So the example I'm going to use is one with which I'm intimately familiar. This is a building on the University of Southern California campus where I work. So I am there almost on a daily basis. I took this picture early in the morning so you can see the main doors are closed. I will point out a few things about the visual aspect of libraries in reading this particular example. So this is a very frontal building. When you look at the building like this, you can tell what the front entrance is and what is not an entrance. And also this building, designed in 1932 in a kind of a historic style, has steps. And that's another important visual idiom, both for reading this building in a visual architectural way, but also in terms of accessibility. When I mentioned frontality, I contrast it with a different type of architecture, specifically post-World War II architecture in the international style. This is an example of that. Another building on our campus, the one with the tower on top of it, has quite a few classrooms. It has several academic departments. It has one of our libraries. USC is a large library system, so we have about 20 libraries. And in this case, one of our libraries, the Library for International and Public Affairs, is housed in this building as well. The international style buildings, and you will probably recognize them from your environments, have equal access on all sides. They're not frontal at all. So when you approach a building like this, the sense of it is it's democratic. At the same time, you don't necessarily know where to enter this building in order to reach your classroom, or where is the entrance to the library, or where can I enter in order to go and talk to my professor in department XYZ. So not a frontal building, a democratic building, or at least that's the symbolic conception of buildings like this, whereas this building has very strong frontality. The steps, as I mentioned earlier, are very important in certain types of design, and you will probably recognize that. This is a way to tell you that you're about to enter a grand institution. A courthouse, think of the Supreme Court for the United States, a major museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, quite a few libraries. You're going up the steps and you're leaving the humdrum of everyday life behind because you're about to enter the Temple of Wisdom and Truth. So this can be intimidating to people, especially for the first time. And of course, it is a major issue for those people who have physical access mobility. So both a very important visual idiom and also a very important practice around access to a library. When we enter a building like this, and again, you probably will recognize such an example, we enter a grand space of a library lobby, And I took this picture deliberately during a exhibition curated by an undergraduate course that used some of our collections in this building to allow students to curate our collection of, I think, pre-contact works. That is Spanish contact with the native people in Central America. We have some resources in the library, and the course was organized around that. But I took this picture because it gives you some sense of scale of humans being lost in this grand marble, precious metals, stained glass windows lobby of our main research library. And again, as you enter this building, going up the steps, you enter through the great doors, you enter this grand lobby, and you hopefully say, wow, as in W-O-W exclamation point. And then you probably get lost in a grand space like this, because as a student, maybe you want to find a quiet space to study. Perhaps as a researcher, you need to check out some books. Where are you going to go from this grand space? Again, very important visual reading on a visceral level that leaves us maybe wowed, but also potentially helpless. So to enter entering a different space within this building, the book stacks, we enter a very compressed space, very common to historic library spaces, by the way. The Doheny Library is not the only such example. And you can see to the right of the screen, this is me. I'm of average height. In a crowd of people, I will not stand up. But if I lift my hand, my arm, I can very easily touch the ceiling of the book stacks. That's how compressed that space is. And to the left, you will see a picture of a part of the Doheny book stacks. And there's such a labyrinth. You can so easily get lost among the hundreds of thousands of books in this building that many years ago, we put, I guess, red tape to let users of the library find their way back to the steps, to the exit, to the elevator. So a very kind of different, maybe intimidation, if you will, of space, of visual context, and of the library as truly a labyrinth. There is a history to such library design. Again, this is not unusual. Part of it has to do with the fact that until the mid-1960s, many academic libraries had closed book stacks. So users would come to the circulation desk after checking the card catalog for whatever they need. And the user will say, you know, I need this and that book, I need this and that journal. And a library employee would go page the materials, bring them to the circulation desk to allow the user to check them out. And so we crammed these spaces with books because in essence, they weren't public and we could put books wherever we could find space. Once we opened the book stacks in the 1960s, users like you and I were then allowed to enter of their own accord and get lost, get intimidated, or find quiet spaces. Really depends on the personality. So again, very important way of reading both access, visual space of libraries vis-a-vis access in many of its manifestations. Now, second example that I'm going to give you, quite eccentric, partly because I think libraries and librarians are eccentric. I'm truly convinced of that. So we'll see if it works on you. Libraries, of course, are repositories of human knowledge or aspects of human knowledge. And if we remember back on the 5 laws of Ranganathan, libraries are for use. In libraries, we very often privilege textual information because we think we work with books, and very often we do. Most libraries are repositories of books or print materials, but of course, that's not necessarily always the case. We collect media. We're also digital repositories or repositories of digitized and born digital materials. And even in print, if you think about it, most print publications include visual materials, photographs, drawings. Math books would include equations. Astronomy books would include, photographs of astronomers' instruments. Medical books include photographs of medical related issues. So most books have visual materials in them. In some disciplines, the visual is the main text, and the textual is the accompaniment and the sort of the secondary information. So again, speaking of meta-literacy as being an important part of libraries and of librarianship. So coming back to my next example of visuality that's rather eccentric, bear with me. I'm going to use an example of a medieval cathedral. That's the eccentric part of it. So this cathedral in the city of Naumburg in Germany, consecrated almost 1,000 years ago, is one of the important sites designated by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization as a World Heritage Site, something that's worthy of preservation. Like many medieval European cathedrals, this one was built over a period of time, various types of architectures, as maybe you can see in this picture. One of the important things that makes this cathedral important and also has sort of brings up libraries as repositories of research, in this case, art historical and also political research, are sculptures of donors. So there were 12 rich people around the year 1000 who donated funds to start the cathedral. We know who the donors were because of preservation of parish records in this case. And among the 12 donors, there are two couples. All 12 donors are represented in these magnificent sculptures, but I'm going to center on the couples. They are based on historic parish records. We think we know who they are: Eckhard and Uta, Hermann and Riglindis, and they were executed by a person who is known by art historians simply as the Master of Naumburg. A sculptor, we don't know anything about him except that he worked in this particular cathedral and in another cathedral elsewhere. And he has a particular style, which is why he's called the master, but we really don't know a whole lot about him. And these sculptures are based, are from the year 1245. In the formal way, as we look at these sculptures, what strikes us about them is their humanity. They seem to represent human beings rather than types, right? Now, we don't know, in fact, who the sitters are. And there is this idea that maybe because they are so human and humane, that the Master of Naumburg perhaps used sitters in trying to figure out how to represent the important donors. So again, we don't know anything about him. We don't know anything about the sitters, assuming he used sitters. And we also don't know who, and these are obviously not representations of the donors. The donors lived 200 years before the Master of Naumburg, but he's paying kind of, he's commemorating them in these sculptures. And now, so this might be slightly eccentric and peculiar to medieval times, but interestingly enough, these sculptures played a role in the development of Nazi ideology in Germany. So Nazis were very interested in defining Aryanism, not Aryanism in a historic sense, but Aryanism in a symbolic sense. Nazi ideologues said that Aryan culture was superior to all else, and they focused on these sculptures as representative of Aryan culture. So the woman at top left wearing a crown, who is thought to represent a donor named Uta. She came from a prominent family, gave a lot of money to the establishment of the cathedral, was seen by Nazi ideologues as representing Aryan virtue in medieval Germany. And the woman to the right, wearing a bonnet and smiling so cryptically, is thought to be a donor named Riglindis. She was the daughter of the King of Poland and therefore a Slav. And Nazi ideologues said that Slavs, Poles, Russians, Serbs, whoever, were pretty much down low on the totem pole of humanity, a little bit above Jews, gays, and blacks, but not a whole lot. So Nazi ideologues said that this woman, representing a cunning Slav, has a cunning smile. Now, using the feminine to represent great virtues and concepts is not confined to Nazi Germany. This is an old way of symbolic representation. Here is an example from my own campus, a centrally located fountain, known as the four cornerstones of democracy. And democracy, being a kind of a virtual concept, is represented by 4 feminine figures. And in case you're wondering what they represent, they are inscribed. So they're community, home, school, and church. Again, feminine concepts, very virtuous. One of them is holding a child, one of them is praying, one of them is holding a book, etc. So again, not an unusual way to represent high concepts and ideals. You use the feminine, and that's what the Nazi ideologues did with these sculptures. The problem with this reading that art historical analysis in books, in publications has pointed out, and in parish records has pointed out, is that the woman presumed to be the virtuous Aryan medieval woman is wearing a crown, whereas Uta, the virtuous German woman, was a daughter of nobility, but not a daughter of a king. Whereas the woman wearing a bonnet was a daughter of a king. So perhaps the Nazi ideologues did not read their historic records correctly, and the attributions should be reversed. The virtuous woman, or the one who appears to be virtuous, is in fact the cunning Slav, and the one who appears to be cunning is in fact a representation of the virtuous German woman. So to sort of come back to the libraries, it is thanks to libraries as repositories that we can contextualize these readings, and very often librarians are called to assist in finding this information, or even to participate in creating a context for this historic mining of both visual and textual evidence. The very last example I will propose to you is that libraries themselves are content and data and are about visuality and accessibility. And what do I mean by this? I'm going to start off by an example from the Southern Poverty Law Center that puts statistics into a visual format. So this is a map developed by SPLC to track down the distribution of anti-government and hate groups within the United States. SPLC tracks this information down. They have a particular definition as to what's an active anti-government and what's an active hate group. But they also provide this information in a visual format so that you, the researcher, the reader, can see where the distribution is. And so we can see on the East Coast, there is more, there is less recorded in the middle of the country, a little bit more to the West Coast, and Hawaii and Alaska are outliers in terms of numbers, maybe because they are off the edge of the known universe. I don't know. SPLC also documented that there has been a trend downward between the year 2020. They have similar information for the year 2020 and the year 2021, the map of which I show you. So when we look at statistical distribution in the visual sense, we can start thinking why things are happening, perhaps the way they are, why there might be a downward trend between the year 2020 and 2021 for a variety of reasons, one of which might be that some of the rhetoric of these groups has become part of the mainstream. And so maybe the number of the groups themselves has gone down, but there could be other interpretations as well. But this visuality allows us for an additional form of access that maybe we wouldn't have if this information was presented perhaps purely as statistical data in terms of numbers. If we look at libraries, we can look at libraries in a similar way, and we do this often in libraries. So when we look at print materials and how much space they take in our book stacks, such as an example in the left, we can present this information visually so that we can start making decisions moving forward about how much materials do we buy in print? How do we preserve and steward the historic legacy of our collections? We do the same with use of libraries. An example of a reading room in one of our libraries early in the morning. It's hard to see in this photograph, but there is one person sitting behind one of the columns studying. As the day progresses, there are more people using this room, so we can plot this information both visually and statistically to start making decisions about library hours, about furniture, about use of the library in general. So libraries themselves are part of this visual context and data that we think about in this context of meta-literacy that informs our work and our study. So let's see. I guess this is kind of an admonition, or maybe a didactic admonition to incorporate visuality into our practice and into our study. Accessibility, or rather accessibilities, and I'm using the plural deliberately in this case, is about meta-literacy. And I've sprinkled a few examples to indicate what I mean by this. So I hope you found this, hopefully, as a useful framing on libraries as you're considering an LIS degree, or for those of you who are graduating soon, as you're thinking about the LIS profession. And here I'm going to plug our program at the USC Marshall School of Business. We, and I as an instructor, we aim to graduate future professionals who are comfortable with notions of management, because librarianship is a management profession, whether we are called managers or in specifically management positions, or if we're managing data, if we're managing collections, if we're managing library spaces, whatever it is, it's a management profession. And also we aim to graduate professionals who are comfortable with understanding that libraries are multimodal and hybrid. So being a good librarian, I'm including sources